Good afternoon and welcome to Hebrew at the Center's Skira webinar. I'm Rabbi Andrew Ergis, CEO of Hebrew at the Center, the organization dedicated to revolutionizing the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We work in many different settings, in day schools, in camps, in public schools, in charter schools, and in any other place where people are interested in seeing changes to the positive in behaviors, attitudes, and student outcomes around Hebrew language education. In Hebrew, the word Skira means inquiry or exploration, and our Skira series is designed to be a platform to bring new research on Hebrew and on Hebrew language education to a broader audience. We're very excited today to be co-hosting this wonderful Skira program in partnership with CASG, and we're looking forward to hearing the new findings about Hebrew education in part-time Jewish education settings. Before we get started, we'd love to have a sense of who is in the Zoom with us. And so I'm going to put up a quick poll so that everyone can let us know what sort of perspective they represent as they come to this question of Hebrew in part-time Jewish settings. I see people are starting to respond. We had over 250 registrants for this webinar, and we are excited to get a sense of who's in the room. Let's take 10 more seconds. I can see lots of people posting their different perspectives. Thank you. All right, let's see what we have here in our Zoom. Well, first of all, 34% of our participants are school directors, and another 30% are Hebrew teachers. We're so pleased to have so many practitioners in the room with us. 8% indicated that they're researchers, and another 7% indicated that they are clergy. We have 7% funders, 6% lay leaders, and 2% are undergraduate or graduate students, with a full 15% of you indicating that you represent a different position within the educational landscape. Now that we have a sense of who's here, let's get started. So once again, a shout out to CASG. Thank you for all joining us, and let's see what we can learn about Hebrew language education in a part-time Jewish setting.
Well, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us this morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you happen to be. We just wanted to also thank CASG and Hebrew at the Center for facilitating this webinar for us. As I think you all know, hopefully by now, the title of our study is Let's Stop Calling It Hebrew School, Rationales, Goals, and Practices of Hebrew Education in Part-Time Jewish Schools. And I'll just here read sort of the abstract of our study. Although the official name of a part-time Jewish education program might be religious school, limud, or the like, some persist in calling it Hebrew school. This leads to an expectation that students will graduate with speaking ability in Hebrew, and a perception, therefore, that the schools are failing in their primary task. So our study investigated the what, the how, and the why of Hebrew education in these settings. To give you an overview of what we plan to discuss in the webinar, we'll give us a little bit of background about Hebrew in the US. We'll talk about the methods of our study, the what, how, and why of Hebrew education, and then we'll get into some depth around satisfaction and goals of different stakeholders, the helping and hindering factors as perceived by the stakeholders within Jewish education settings. And we'll end the presentation with a set of recommendations for Hebrew education, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A and discussion. So to provide some background about Hebrew in the US and Hebrew education, when Hebrew was revernacularized in Israel and the presence of Israelis in the US, these two components have led to changes in how Jews understand Hebrew and the goals of Hebrew education more broadly. Historically, part-time Jewish schools had more contact hours and were able to focus more expressly on Hebrew efficiency. For example, the Benderly boys' Ivrit Beivrit. And then, of course, the bar and bat mitzvah became an important organizing principle in American synagogues and their schools. So our study was focused on a primary research question of how Hebrew is taught and perceived at American Jewish part-time schools. And the sub-foci for our study were the rationales and goals, the types of Hebrew that were taught, and the skills that were the focus, what teaching methods and curricular materials do educators use, and what are the different stakeholders' perceptions of success within their settings. Ours was a mixed method study that was done before COVID-19, and our data collection was in fall 2018, focused on 20 expert interviews and a survey of 519 school directors. In spring 2019, we did the subsample of 8 schools that represented diversity in denomination, region, size, and approach, including surveys of stakeholders, the students, parents, teachers, and clergy, and augmented by classroom observations in those schools and 4 additional schools. The data analysis was focused on both quantitative and qualitative data. So as you can see, we did our best to integrate a number of different school settings in different states for the observations and the constituent surveys across the country. So to give some background about how Hebrew language education can be approached and how language education more broadly can be approached, you can focus on the one hand on communication. So the 4 skills many times we talk about as speaking, listening, writing, and reading. And you can also focus on ritual participation, so decoding and recitation. These, generally speaking, map onto the communication focus, onto modern Hebrew, and the ritual participation maps on, in broad strokes, to textual Hebrew. So a couple of frameworks that would be useful for your understanding our study more broadly is first metalinguistic community, which is a framework focused on building communities in the Hebrew school setting that are focused on beliefs, connection, relationship, valuing of the language, and knowledge of the language. In some cases, students may not fully be proficient in the language, but they do know about the language and they have a relationship and value the language. This framing focuses on what is happening in these settings as opposed to a more deficit view of talking about what is not happening. In addition, ethno-linguistic infusion is a set of practices in which students are exposed to linguistic elements of the language. The metaphor of infusion, if you think about a drink of water that would be infused with strawberries or some other fruit, that you get the taste of the language even if you don't have the full flavor. So this includes vocabulary, songs, and signs, and we'll talk in more detail about what this looks like in different settings. So if we then look at the traditional approaches to heritage language education, whether that be immigrant, indigenous, diaspora, minority languages, in terms of communication and ritual participation, we can add to these components both metalinguistic community and ethno-linguistic infusion, both of which focus on relationships among the individual, the language, and the group. So that is the primary focus of what you'll see in our study, was that in many cases, the focus in Hebrew education settings is on ritual participation and building a metalinguistic community through, in many cases, practices of ethno-linguistic infusion. So we'll start now to talk about our findings. First, we'll talk about what is taught in Hebrew education settings. So as you can see, there are a number of aspects of Jewish life and Hebrew language that are the focus in terms of what is being taught, from Jewish holidays and rituals to values and ethics, Torah studies, components of Hebrew, prayers, Israel, God and theology. And as you can see towards the top is Hebrew in terms of reciting prayers and Hebrew in terms of decoding. So this maps onto what we were just describing. However, conversational Hebrew is used much less across these settings. And so we really in our study focus on contexts that are both more Hebrew rich on the right-hand side, so there's more conversation and there's more modern Hebrew, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which we consider to be less Hebrew rich, which are more focused on decoding and on textual Hebrew. Most schools recognize that proficiency is unlikely in the limited hours that they have, considering that these are part-time Jewish settings, but they do expose students to routinized elements of Hebrew in fun and communal ways. And most schools, we noted, do focus on practices of Hebrew infusion, including songs, signs, and teaching what is called Jewish life vocabulary. So you'll hear more about that as well.
Thank you, Netta. I'm Sarah, and I'll take over from here. So how is Hebrew taught in these part-time Jewish schools? You see that the use of communal prayer, Jewish life vocabulary, games and fun activities, and Hebrew songs are the most common. And these are all practices of Hebrew infusion. And Hebrew signs and labels is as well. That's a little bit less, but still common. And then Hebrew through movement is an increasingly popular activity that incorporates some elements of interest in language proficiency. But one of the goals of this is to make Hebrew fun and to focus on the affective goals that we'll tell you about in a minute. But we did find that conversation is not common in most of the settings where we did our research. One teacher said modern conversational Hebrew is not the primary goal. The primary goal of our program is to educate the students in Hebrew that will allow them to pray with other Jews and to succeed at their bar and bat mitzvahs. And indeed, bar and bat mitzvah is really a prime motivator for many families to participate in Jewish education. Also, I would ask you to hold your questions and comments until the end. We will have a time for you to write in the chat later. Now, this focus on bar and bat mitzvah causes tension. One educational leader talked about bar and bat mitzvah as the third rail of Jewish education. I've heard it from many educators. It's the big obstacle, but it's also the big opportunity. Why is it a big opportunity? Because it's what brings people in the first place and is a motivator for them to not only participate, but to actually do the work to learn the language for ritual participation. So we were really interested in this question of rationales for Hebrew education. And we asked, to what extent is bar or bat mitzvah a motivator for you to study or for your school to teach Hebrew? And one thing we found was that the school directors value Hebrew for reasons other than bar and bat mitzvah more than for bar and bat mitzvah. And that is also true with clergy. But teachers are about the same. Parents and students are in the opposite direction. That is, they value Hebrew for bar and bat mitzvah more than for other reasons. But notice that still a large majority of parents and a majority of students also value Hebrew for reasons other than bar and bat mitzvah. So we also asked for various rationales for interest in Hebrew education. And here you see the white lines are the director's expectations of what parents think. And the pink bars are the parents' rationales. And you see slight differences here. You see that the directors think that parents value Hebrew for parents value Hebrew for bar and bat mitzvah prep even more than they do, and much less than they do for these other reasons. That Hebrew is a language of the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and even American Jewish life and culture. One thing that was pretty surprising to us in our findings was the high levels of student satisfaction. The students that we surveyed are generally happy not only with their school, but with Hebrew education at their school. And they generally feel a sense of accomplishment about their Hebrew knowledge. They hope to learn more Hebrew in high school, college, or beyond. And even 53% of them think that Hebrew is fun. So it seems that these schools are succeeding in these affective goals, these goals of loving Hebrew and feeling a personal connection to it. And interestingly, we found that all groups are generally satisfied with the school and its Hebrew education, but a bit less satisfied with the school's education than with the school overall. when we look at specific goals, we find some interesting similarities and differences. So this is a kind of a complicated image, but the colors correspond to the different groups, and then each group of recitation, decoding, comprehension, etc. These are goals within those categories. So we find that recitation and decoding goals are very important. They're more important than comprehension, conversation, and writing goals. And that aligns with what Netta was talking about earlier with the focus on textual Hebrew rather than modern Hebrew. We also find that affective goals are the most important for all of the groups. See how that category is highest. And this includes those things that I was talking about before, like associating Hebrew with Jewishness and feeling personally connected to Hebrew. And we see that school directors, the kind of peach or coral color, their bars are lower for most of the categories than all the other groups for the recitation and comprehension, and especially the conversation and writing. Why? Well, this is probably because they have a more realistic sense of what is possible in the schools with the limited contact hours. And now I'll turn it over to Nikki.
Thank you, Sarah. So in our surveys, we asked each of these different constituents about what are the things that are helpful for you in Hebrew education. So what are those helping factors? And then in a little bit, we'll also talk about the hindering factors. What are the things that you feel hinder your ability to do Hebrew education? So these are some of the things that people indicated were the factors that really help with Hebrew education. So one is about having clear, attainable, measurable goals. And that also sometimes includes assessment to figure out how you're doing vis-a-vis your goals. Another factor is communication, of building relationships and buy-in. This is across all different stakeholders, teachers, parents, students, director, clergy, etc., and really communicating goals and progress. Another really important helping factor is teachers, having experienced teachers, committed, motivated, engaging. We heard this a lot about how important that is. And also having a smaller class size, small groups, differentiation, and individualized attention, or having students work at their own pace is something that people mentioned is very helpful, including leveling based on ability rather than grade. We also heard from people that sometimes having an optional additional instruction, so that may be sort of an opt-in additional piece for Hebrew learning for those that are interested, is something that can be helpful. And also sometimes a small amount of gamified homework. So meaning if the school is offering some sort of small amount of homework, especially if it's in the mode of games, that is something that can be helpful. And last but not least, a number of people mentioned as a helping factor the particular approach that they're using for education. We heard from many people that the Onward Hebrew approach has been helpful, and one element of that, Hebrew through movement, as I think Sarah noted earlier, is something that is becoming used more and more by schools, and that they mentioned as a helping factor for their Hebrew education. So what are the factors that these various groups indicated that were hindering their ability to do Hebrew education? This goes without saying. The limited contact hours was definitely something that was mentioned a lot. We asked about contact hours. The average number of hours for, I believe this was 6th grade, because we asked at different grades, but for 6th grade, the average number of contact hours for the school, for the part-time school, is 3.9 hours a week, 1.7 of those hours on Hebrew specifically. Also, students and parents competing priorities, and their lives are overscheduled, and the poor motivation is sometimes a hindering factor as well. We mentioned homework earlier. Sometimes homework can be helpful, but one of the hindering factors is that sometimes students don't do the homework that was expected, so that can be challenging. Also, we mentioned earlier, a helping factor can be teachers. The flip side is true as well, which is that there is a shortage of teachers who are skilled, experienced, and able to speak and especially to teach Hebrew. And that was mentioned by many of a really significant factor in hindering Hebrew education. Again, we talked earlier about goals and the importance of aligning and communicating goals. One of the hindering factors for Hebrew education is unclear goals or conflicting goals. And that means conflicting sometimes between different constituencies. So the director, the clergy, the teachers, the parents, what are the different goals? First of all, was there communication about it? But even if so, sometimes those come into conflict of what those goals are. So based on our findings, and we'll share with you the link to the full report because there is a lot of information and we're just giving a little snippet during our time together today. But based on our findings, we've come up with a series of recommendations. So these are some of them. So number one, we've talked about encouraging your community to stop calling it Hebrew school, except where Hebrew language proficiency is the primary focus. So this just has to do with nomenclature, that when we call it Hebrew school, people assume you're going to learn Hebrew, and that means full spoken language proficiency. And we all, I think, recognize that that's not really possible in the limited hours that we have, and that it feeds into this problem of the conflicting goals and expectations for what we're doing in these settings. We recommend engaging in collaborative visioning with all stakeholders about Hebrew education. So again, it's visioning and goal setting with all the different stakeholders at the table so that there's clarity about what the goals are. And those goals might vary from school to school, program to program, but the important part is that it's a collaborative effort so that everyone knows what the goals are. We recommend making students' connection to Hebrew an explicit goal. As Sarah mentioned, that already is something that's happening in schools where there is ethno-linguistic infusion. There is the effort to build this meta-linguistic community, a community of students, teachers, parents who love Hebrew and value Hebrew, but it's not always an explicit goal. And sometimes perhaps even thought of as like, oh, it's sort of a side thing. But here, we're really recommending them making that an explicit and clear goal, because that is something that's both achievable and desirable when we asked about the different goals that people have. So infusing even more Hebrew through fun activities, songs, signs, and really focusing on that effort to build a Hebrew meta-linguistic community. Another recommendation is that when teaching decoding, so the ability to sound out the Hebrew letters and vowel signs, to spend less time in large groups and more time in one-on-one and small group configurations. That had a greater level of perceived success when we asked directors about how they perceive their programs and the success of their programs. So with parent buy-in, if this is something that's agreed upon as a community, that it might be possible to consider offering a small amount of gamified homework. Again, the limited hours is a challenge that was mentioned often. And so how do we think in creative ways about extending the hours? And of course, one way to do that is to extend the learning to home. But when it's done in a small amount and with a game kind of model in a gamified way, that's something that could be beneficial. We also recommend the possibility of offering multiple tracks or an enrichment option for families interested in conversational Hebrew. That if that's not the primary goal of the program, there are some families for whom that might be more of a goal, and so maybe that's a separate option that they could be part of, recognizing that that might not be the option for everybody. Those initial 6 recommendations were really focused on the schools themselves. We also have a recommendation for the field, which is really more about infrastructure, that we recommend nationwide and regional educational infrastructure should offer more funded online training for teachers, information sharing, and consulting and training for school directors. We do know some of this exists, but interestingly, a lot of the directors didn't seem to know that it exists. And our sense from this study is that more of it is needed, that all of it felt like there is a great desire amongst school directors to learn more, and a lot more is needed also for training teachers. And so the more that that can be provided regionally and nationally would be very helpful. So we really want to express our gratitude to CASTG for the funding to do this project. It's been about a 2-year project, and we're really grateful for the support for doing it. And we appreciate Hebrew at the Center for having us today. And we worked with a number of different assistants, research assistants, editorial assistants, some of whom are on this call, so we really appreciate your help. We also worked with graphic designers for the infographic that was created for sharing some of the results, and also the report itself. There is the report is, there's a website that we will share with you to be able to read the full report. And we also published recently an article in eJewish Philanthropy that you can read. So we tried to keep this piece relatively short, just sort of some highlights. We have a lot of time now for questions and discussion, and we know there already, I think, are a couple of questions. So we will shift into kind of Q&A and discussion mode. We know there is a lot of expertise and interest on this call. So, so the floor is open for questions. We are in a Zoom format where I believe you cannot speak live. So we'll take your questions and comments in the chat or in the Q&A box. So I'm going to turn it over to Netta, I think.
Sure. Yeah. So, so there are some great questions coming in already. So there are some questions, and I don't know, maybe Sarah, if you'd like to take these questions around our methods. So the sample, whether it's representative, whether we looked at gender as a variable, what age were the children, were the differences we found statistically significant, sample recruitment, and then there are other questions around the name Hebrew School, which we'll save. But I don't know, Sarah, if you might want to take that one, that set of questions.
Sure. We don't know how representative our sample is because there is no census of part-time Jewish schools. So we sent out the request to participate in our study to lists of school directors that were parts of various networks, conservative, reform, reconstructionist schools. And then we also got lists from various BJEs from cities around the country and regions. And we also advertised the survey on various groups like JEDLab on Facebook and a Chabad educators group on Facebook. And so we don't actually know exactly how many schools are out there because we did get responses from some schools that weren't part of the initial invitation list. So we don't know how representative it is, but we do know that we looked at some diversity factors in terms of the regions that the schools are located in and whether they are part of a synagogue or not. The vast majority are part of a synagogue, which I think is reflective of what we understand as being the population. And I also will point out that, oh wait, that question just disappeared, so I can't look at it anymore. Oh wait, hold on, let me see if I can. There we go. Right, so then you asked about gender, and we did not look at gender as a variable for the students who filled out the survey, but that's something we might look at later. Actually, I don't think we asked about their gender. Yeah, I don't think we did, so we can't look at that. And the age of students, we only sent this to students in grades 4 through 7. At some schools, it was just 6th grade. At some schools, it was 5th and 6th, depending on how big the schools were. There were a few schools that were so tiny that we needed to include some 4th graders as well. But most of the students were in 6th grade. And we, yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
I'm going to try to answer a question Jonathan Krasner asked. He said, your first recommendation is interesting because synagogues and the movements haven't been calling it Hebrew school for many years. It is typically called religious school, which by the way is also a problem, but that's for another day. So I'm wondering why you think the name Hebrew school has stuck and continues to be used by parents and kids, even though the term hasn't been used by most professionals for many years, which is, that question was also asked by a couple of others in a similar vein, which is sort of, why do you think that the name Hebrew school is the problem? And is there some evidence that calling it Hebrew school is then leading to these mismatched expectations? So I would say that, first of all, Jonathan, I'm sure you may have some thoughts about that question as yourself. From our study, we didn't ask about the name and how the name was connected. So this is conjecture in terms of the relationship of the calling it of Hebrew school and the mismatched expectations. There was very clear mismatched expectations that what we heard from school directors was different than what we were hearing from students and parents about, especially around Hebrew comprehension and the ability to really learn language in that time, that there seemed to be a difference there, that there was some tension around. So why do people keep calling it Hebrew school? My guess, just as a school director, is that for many parents, the driving factor to sign up is still bar and bat mitzvah, which we saw they value that more than some of the other reasons for learning Hebrew. And when they think about bar and bat mitzvah training, the role of Hebrew learning is pretty significant. That even though there's going to be a Devar Torah and there's other aspects of becoming bar and bat mitzvah, the part about learning Hebrew feels primary. And that even though that is around decoding and prayer recitation, it's still Hebrew learning. So my sense is that people still call it Hebrew school because they're sending their kids to this schooling type of program to learn some Hebrew. That's my guess, is it kind of makes sense. It's educational and it's learning Hebrew. And I guess I don't want to get too caught up on the name. I don't think calling it Hebrew school is the end of the world. But we gave our project that title because it kind of summed up the tension of expectation and what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is largely very successful in terms of meeting the goals that directors have and that communities have for recitation and communal participation and building a community of people who really value and love Hebrew. And there's a lot of positive things going on, but the discourse around these schools is still often a discourse of failure. So we felt like highlighting the way that that name itself has tension within it was useful.
And someone asked if the students are pre or post B'nai Mitzvah. They're all pre-B'nai Mitzvah.
Just a little follow-up there. There are some follow-up questions about the names and if we have suggestions for what you should call it instead and everything. And I think it actually connects with our recommendation around the collaborative visioning that you do within your context to really decide all of the stakeholders coming together in ways that make sense for you and that context to say, what are our priorities? What do we want to do? In some cases, that might include a lot of Hebrew, in which case you might want to keep calling it Hebrew school, but really deciding together and that really guiding your decision-making, those pieces are connected. So we could, sit down with you and think of all kinds of names, but the idea is, for you to really be thinking what makes sense in your context.
I want to add one more thing because I'm looking at the chat, lots of comments about what we call this thing. And several of you have mentioned that many schools call part of their program Hebrew school, meaning if it's a one-day-a-week program, it's religious school or some other title. And then when there's a second day of the week, that's the Hebrew school part. Sometimes that is connected into the pedagogy, which is that second day, there's more of a focus on Hebrew than the other part. But some of what we saw was that in these programs, the goals around building connection to Hebrew are not only about teaching the prayer skills and the decoding skills, etc. So that connection to Hebrew and love of Hebrew and infusing Hebrew into the environment is something that could happen on any day of the week as part of the program. So even bifurcating it out as its own separate subject is not necessarily the only way to think about what we're doing in Jewish education.
So somebody asked about statistical significance. All of the differences that we report in the report are statistically significant. And the response rate for the students differed in different settings. They were done in the classroom. And in some schools, only a few of the students participated, and in others, all of them or most of them did. And yes, Melissa Herman asks, might their positive responses be correlated with their interest in responding to the survey? That is certainly possible, but we did get some students who hated Hebrew education and who mentioned that in their survey, or who said, I'm just here for the bar mitzvah. As soon as I'm done, that's it. I have no interest in Hebrew other than that. But you're right that the rates could be influenced by that. It is not because we gave them the option of participating or not, it is not it's not all of the students who participated in these settings. And somebody else asked about whether we looked at the correlations between teacher preparation. This is Elisa Shapiro-Rosenberg, between teacher preparation and Hebrew outcomes. And no, we did not look at that, but that is something that could be looked at in the future. But note that we didn't actually look at Hebrew outcomes. We looked at perceptions of Hebrew outcomes. So we looked at what the school director feels that the students are succeeding in by the time that they graduate. And also we looked at students' own understandings of their sense of success, but we didn't test anybody in their Hebrew skills, and we didn't attend their B'nai Mitzvah to see how they perform on their decoding. But we do have their affective responses, their responses to questions about their feelings about Hebrew education. So those kinds of things are their actual outcomes, at least what they are willing to report on a survey.
I think, do you want me to?
Yeah, Nick, if you want to take, there are some questions about Hebrew, Hebrew through movement and onward Hebrew.
Sure, I'm just trying to find them. There's so many questions coming in. Hold on.
One
Can
from
you
Dylan
read them out
Abrams.
loud?
Sure. So one of them is, what has been the success rate of programs like Onward Hebrew, which delay decoding until 6th grade? There's another question about learning to decode Hebrew without the ability to understand what they're reading, and whether, you know, to what extent is that effective or not. And then and then did the respondents say why Hebrew through movement was a helping factor? So those were all connected.
Okay. So I want to start by saying what our study did and what our study did not do, which I know Sarah said earlier, but I'm going to kind of reiterate, which is that this particular study did not measure student outcomes. So we were not assessing students' abilities in any of these different categories, in decoding, in prayer recitation, in comprehension. These were we did some observations, so there was a little bit from that kind of qualitative data, but a lot of this came from the responses that we heard directly from directors, 500 plus directors of schools, and their perceptions of success. So whether the students are or are not successful, we can't say other than what was reported by the directors. So in terms of the questions around Onward Hebrew and Hebrew through movement, some of you know I've been involved with Onward Hebrew and have given presentations on that. So in some elements, I feel like that's sort of a presentation for another day about Onward Hebrew and its philosophy and why I believe strongly that it works so well. I will say in my synagogue, we've been using that type of approach to Hebrew for about 8 years, and it's going very, very well, and our students are very successful in achieving the goals that we set out. The question around decoding without comprehension, which I think was one of the questions, I would say this is how Hebrew has been taught in many of these part-time Jewish education programs for a very, very long time. So, not forever, but certainly in the last generation or two. This gets at the limited contact hours. We only have so much time. It's not possible in that amount of time to really teach language in a full way in terms of language proficiency. We can't teach language proficiency. And so, but there is the goal of students being able to sound out and pronounce the Hebrew, particularly as it relates to ritual participation like prayer. That raises questions of, why does it matter if you can sound out the words? What if you know them by heart? Can you sing along with the prayers? The truth is most new decoders cannot decode fast enough to participate in prayer anyway. So then there's a question about the oral input as well, or the auditory input as well as the visual input. But at the end of the day, the goal in most of these programs, as articulated by the directors, is about ritual participation and the ability to read or chant Torah at their bar bat mitzvah, to be able to participate in prayers. And so decoding becomes a piece of that puzzle. But comprehension of everything they're decoding, I would say, is not very realistic, which most of the school directors seem to understand in terms of their responses, that comprehension was a little bit less of a goal. Hebrew through movement does have a comprehension goal. And I think one of the reasons it's popular and that directors shared that it was popular is partly because it's fun and enjoyable and engaging and something that the kids like, but also that it's effective in teaching vocabulary. So it seems to be a modality that kids do learn what things mean. They learn it by doing it and hearing it. So then when they learn how to decode something, there's a much larger vocabulary to build on. I guess I'll stop there. I think there's a lot of other comments about that, but I'll stop there for now.
So there are a number of questions just about kind of the difference in perspectives between families and students and the different stakeholders, and any suggestions or recommendations that we might have for how to kind of broach those topics or have those discussions. So if either of you want to share, and I'll see if I can chime in about kind of the practicalities of making sense of the differences in perspective.
Making sense of it, or trying to get people on the same page?
Both, I think, is sort of the theme. Like I want to, like Leslie Milrod wrote, I'd like to invite the parents into a discussion. Any suggestions on how to open a conversation, specific questions, or an outline for what to talk about? Or Lynn Lieberman asked, has any community used the study to explore or discuss their philosophy approach activities? So those kinds of questions about what can you share with families about building building these
Yes, I
communities.
should probably take that. So to answer the second question, I doubt anyone has used this study yet because it was just published a few days ago. So unless they're working really fast. We've been working on this study for about 2 years, but we just published it last week. So
well, I'll just chime in there, and I'll say
yeah.
that even participating in the study led some school directors to go through a process of visioning. One school director said that she was going to take all of the questions in the survey and about rationales and goals for Hebrew education and pose them to the various constituents. So it is possible that even just taking the survey led to some changes in some schools.
Yeah, and that would be my recommendation. Also, we have shared not only our results, but also our methods. And so you could certainly use these surveys to launch those sorts of conversations, or take some of the questions that we asked communities. You could use those questions just verbatim to ask parents, to ask teachers. I think that what we are hoping is just that it raises the conversation and that it gives the opportunity to explore it in a more nuanced way, rather than, do you want your children to learn Hebrew? You know, why? Well, here are a bunch of different possibilities of what that can look like. Here's different types of rationales and goals you might want to consider. Here's different elements of language education, heritage language education. I think especially the pieces around affective goals and around meta-linguistic community and ethno-linguistic infusion, these ways of connecting to community through Hebrew, is something that is happening, but the language for that hasn't maybe been there. That talking about it in those ways is helpful. And so hopefully this can give some nuance to those conversations in a way that will be helpful.
And I'll just add, in terms of building a metalinguistic community, originally my work on this topic and the more recent work that Sarah, Nikki, and I have been doing on this was more about describing what's happening in the context, as opposed to prescribing that this is what you should be doing. So we were noticing, you know, my original work was on Yiddish, but also just in general in other contexts with indigenous languages and other immigrant languages, diaspora, minoritized languages, that you see what's happening where people feel a relationship to the language, but they may or may not be able to use it. And so the idea here is we're now saying, let's build a metalinguistic community. So there aren't as many resources for how to do that. And, you know, using ethno-linguistic infusion practices is a huge part of that. Having explicit discussions around values and beliefs, listening to songs like what we heard as you were entering the Zoom room, and thinking about what does Hebrew signify for all of us, and what do we have access to if we can't go to Israel, or we don't have access to a Hebrew-speaking community. So I think having those open conversations about what do we want our community to be about is a really important component of that. But there just aren't a lot of resources for how to build a metalinguistic community, and we would love to think that through with all of you.
Yeah, there was a comment here from Neil Toe. That says he's interested to talk maybe even offline about the assumption that's been mentioned several times, that teaching decoding and comprehension are mutually exclusive goals given the amount of contact hours. He said, comprehension, in my view, is not the ability to translate Hebrew word for word, but to be able to have a general idea of the content, what a student reads, for example, by using shorashim, keyword learning for Siddur, etc. So I guess I just want to say, in talking about comprehension and decoding as different goals, I would agree they're not mutually exclusive. You can learn, you know, comprehension, what something means. You can understand shorashim, but we're using comprehension in the way that it would be for this study, in the context of language proficiency, of language education for language proficiency, meaning you comprehend the language in order to speak, read, write, etc. And I think that that's a piece that is more challenging in the limited contact hours. And it's also actually not the goal for most of the stakeholders. So having some understanding of what words mean, or what a certain prayer means, is absolutely a goal. So it's not mutually exclusive, but there is, I think, sometimes an assumption that there's going to be language proficiency taught in these settings, and that is maybe not a goal that's as easily met, or even really the goal that, let's say, other stakeholders have.
Shmuel Feld asked about if we found any difference in teaching methods of biblical, rabbinic, and modern Hebrew. And yes, absolutely. The biblical and rabbinic Well, I would say they're not actually teaching biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. They're teaching decoding of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. There is a little conversation about teaching the meanings of some of these words and more generally the themes of specific prayers. But for teaching the decoding, the method tends to be sounding out the letters of sometimes of nonsense words like ba, bop, bot, right? Like very, very short nonsense words. And then sometimes, and then getting to actual words that are in the prayers or in the Torah. And the method that we found that was common for teaching modern Hebrew was Hebrew through movement, which is also used to teach textual Hebrew as well. And that is basically focused on comprehension, and when students get a little more advanced, on them giving the commands themselves. Just to give you a sense of what Hebrew through movement is, because I think we didn't really explain that for those who don't understand that yet, is that the teacher gives commands in Hebrew, like go to the tree, or put your hand on something red. And then the students are expected to follow those commands. And through that, they're expected to learn some verbs, generally in the infinitive, la lechet, la et, or la sim et hayad al katom, on something orange, right? Then they're expected to learn some verbs and some nouns, and they're also expected to say those things as well in some of the settings. And so this really focuses on the active engagement with language and the kinesthetic learning that is so useful for a lot of people, especially children. And often it then focuses on words that are in our liturgy, like lihadlik et haner, or something like that, to light the candle. Do you guys want to say anything more about Hebrew through movement?
No, I think we only have another minute or two.
Oh, right. Okay.
Go ahead, Netta, are you going to answer Shmuel's question about metalinguistic communities?
Yeah, just quickly, just that there's an edited volume that will be coming out next year that looks at metalinguistic communities all around the world. And then, I'm happy to, talk offline with those who are interested in that framework and what it looks like in different settings. It resonates in many ways with other, immigrant and heritage languages. So happy to talk with you more about that. And then I guess there's just maybe one last question. I know we did our best to address everybody's questions, and thank you everybody for them. The question around student satisfaction and whether we asked why students were satisfied. Do we have any clues about where the satisfaction is coming from? And I would argue that a lot of it has to do with this sort of fun, enjoyable, feeling that students have around the language and all the different activities and exposure to the language in fun and interesting ways. But I don't know if Nikki and Sarah if we want to end on the satisfaction fun note before we wrap up.
I don't recall getting a lot of answers to the why. It was one of many questions in a survey about whether they liked learning Hebrew, etc. So I don't know. And also the students, they could comment, I believe, but
yeah, we do have some responses about, not about that question in particular, but about why they're interested in Hebrew. And so we do have in the report, there is a section there about the qualitative data. And some of them, it is just about their bar and bat mitzvah, but for some, they had some very sophisticated rationales for why they're interested in learning Hebrew, related to being part of a people and culture and tradition. And they use a lot of first person language, like our tradition and our culture. But I really don't know why they feel satisfied with the Hebrew, but we do know why some don't. There are some comments in there explaining what they don't like about their Hebrew education.
So I think We'll move now to, we have one last poll for you where we're going to ask you to share which of the 7 recommendations you think might have the most impact. So you should see that poll in just a second here, and then we'll hear from Ariel and Andrew to kind of wrap up our time together.
I think it's which one do you think is most important based on your experience. And I was hearing from the comments in the chat that especially the piece about not calling it Hebrew school is very controversial. Some people feel like, you know what, maybe it's aspirational, maybe actually it leads to more Hebrew infusion. So it's certainly not, if that were the only takeaway from our report, then I feel like we will have missed the boat. That I'm hoping that this research really gets at more of the what is happening and the various possibilities for what the goals and rationales can be for Hebrew education, and helping helping to get a broader sense of what's happening in the field. So I guess just a minute or two. Andrew, I think you're controlling the poll, so. All right, I guess there's 10 more seconds. There's some questions about contact information. So yes, as when we wrap up in a little bit, there will be some more about follow-up and contact information. And I believe that our slides will be available to people as well. Very interesting. So can everybody see the results? Or are we the only ones who can see them? I don't know. Andrew, can everybody see the results? Okay, you can see. Great. Okay, Sarah or Netta, do we want to share anything as by way of wrap up, and then we'll turn it over to Ariel?
Well, I think it's interesting that there is great interest in the national educational infrastructure, and I think that is something that wouldn't be too hard to do. There are these organizations that already exist for the reform, conservative, reconstructionist movements that could collaborate on something great, perhaps with some involvement from funders.
And I'll just say it's exciting to see how much people care about connection, collaboration, and visioning. So that's nice to see.
Well, and as Andrew pointed out, it's Hebrew at the Center, which is help to make this webinar happen, is one of those organizations that's really trying to be that infrastructure to help with the conversations and training around Hebrew. So that's great. All right, well, we'll turn it over to Ariel from CASG. I think she's going to be wrapping up.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. What a great turnout and fabulous questions. I'm Ariel Levitas. I am the Managing Director of CASG, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, housed at George Washington University. CASG's mission is to improve the quality of knowledge available to guide Jewish education, practice, and policy. We seek to ensure that Jewish education research produces meaningful, reliable, and usable evidence that enables Jewish communities to achieve their highest aspirations for Jewish life and learning. Sarah alluded to this earlier, we don't have definitive numbers on this, but it's fair to estimate that the majority of American children who receive formal Jewish education do so within the context of part-time schooling. And if anyone was interested in doing a census on that, send me an email. The messages that we send about what our intentions are and what success looks like in these settings matter to a large proportion of families raising Jewish children today. I think the study is obviously of tremendous value for those who care about Hebrew language, and in particular the context of Jewish part-time schooling. But even beyond that, and I think that came up in the poll, there's a fundamental implication here for all kinds of settings with all kinds of curricular focus. And that's the value of bringing stakeholders together to clarify goals and intended outcomes for our Jewish educational programs. These are crazy times with lots of pressures, but it's generally time well spent to work with one's community to articulate shared goals. Because if we don't really say what we're trying to accomplish, it's very hard to meet our own highest aspirations. I think of the Hebrew word for compass, mitzafon, and also relatedly the word for North Star, kochavet tzafon, and the word tzafon itself also connotes hiddenness. And I think in dark times, it's important to remember that while orienting destinations can seem hidden, there's really value in reminding ourselves what our highest values and our ultimate aspirations are. So I am going to just close us out with a couple of next steps. And hang on, I'm going to share my screen so that everybody can sort of see some other places that you can go and look for some more information. So first of all, the full report is on the CASG website. Here are the emails for our research team. You'll find the report and the infographic there. I think the infographic is a great tool for sharing with stakeholders. And the report has a lot of other elements of it that there wasn't time to discuss today. It's very rich and detailed, and so I encourage you to look at it. I want to say a special thank you to our friends at Hebrew at the Center, in particular Andrew Ergis and Arnie Winchell, for their partnership in today's program. And if you liked what you saw today, I want to invite you to the next Skira event, which is scheduled for Thursday, August 27th at 1:30 Eastern Time. We'll be looking at language, Hebrew in the context of Jewish summer camps. And if you're interested in more research, if you're hungry for more, you can catch some of these newly released reports on our website at CASG. Finally, I want to give a little plug for the CASG Educator the Census. We are looking to get a count of how many Jewish educators there are in the workforce today in the USA. So if you are a Jewish educational leader, you should have received an invitation to participate. If you haven't received an invitation, you can email us at casgcensus@gw.edu, and we'll make sure that you get access to the survey because we want to make sure that every Jewish educator in the US counts. And just thank you again to our research team for this phenomenal report, and to the funders, the Avichai Foundation and the Jim Joseph Foundation, who support the CASG Small Grants Research Program that this was a part of. So that's the end of our formal presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please be in touch with questions and comments. We look forward to continuing the conversation.